Okay, in this video we will see what are the things you need to take care when you do a backend design. So first thing is, when you are going to design a backend for an application, the first thing you have to do is your design, right? In the design, what are the things to take care is what are the routes you are going to have. Okay, so this is important. And the second thing is, what are the collections you need to have, your database design. Okay, so first identify all these routes, right? What are the different post routes you're going to have, what are the different get routes you have to have, and what are the collection you need to have. Okay, so for example, if I want to design a to do application, this is kind of thing you can have on the base, right? So this is a to do application, and this is the routes I have, post routes, and I have one post route, one get route, and a delete route. And then I have only one collection which stores the title and the description, right? So first identify this, so you'll have a clear idea of what I'm going to do. Okay, so first thing is your design. Okay, so once you have done the design, so this is the first step. You have done a design. Okay, now have a folder structure, right? So if you are creating a web application, you'll have a front end, and you have a back end, right? Create a folder for this. For front end, you can have something called as client or app or something, and for back end, you need to have something called server, or you can name accordingly as per your wish. Okay, so in the server folder, you have to create your project, right? For that, to create a node project, you have to do npm init -y. Okay, so this will create a node project for you, okay, for the backend. So once you have done the created a project, install the needed modules you're going to use. For the backend, you're going to use express server. So npm I is for install express. And then if you are going to use mongodb, you need to install mongoose. This is used to interact with mongodb, mongoose. Okay, and if you want to use environment variable .env, so, and you can install on a need basis also. So for initially you have to install express and mongoose, then on need basis you can install the needed applications. So once you have done this, the next thing, fifth thing you have to do is, just think what are the thing a backend has to do, right? The backend, basically, right, it should process the http request. The http request will come from the client. Okay, it has to process the http request. For that, it has to start a http server. Okay, so first thing you need to do is you need to start a http server. Okay, and once you start the http server, you will get an http request, and your routes will get called. Then you need to implement all the routes. Okay, all routes. And one more thing is, so when a route comes, right, you get a http request to store information in the database, or you'll get http request to get some information in the database. So before you implement all the routes, you need to establish a connection to a database. So in the case, if it is MongoDB, connection to MongoDB. So these are the high level things you need to do when you start a backend, right? So now you know what has to be done. Now you have to think how you have to do it, right? How to start a HTTP server, how to connect to a Mongo database, how to implement all the routes, right? So these things you need to be very clear. So how to start a HTTP server is basically very simple. Okay, so here first thing is you are going to use express to start a HTTP server. So first import express, okay, and assign your express to a variable, and then app.listen will start the HTTP server. Okay, so app.listen starts the HTTP server and on a particular port number. Okay, this port number is basically is there in the .env. Okay, so what I have done is I have installed .env and I have called .config. Now what this .config does it takes all the variables in this .env and it puts in the user environment. Okay, the user environment contains all the list of all the variables, and this process.env returns an object to the user environment. So now you have in config you have put these two variables in the user environment, and process.env will object will have access to the port and other variables in .env. So now you get the port number like this, right? This is a clean way of coding. So basically when you do app.listen, this will start a HTTP server in this port number, and then it will call this function. Okay, when you call this function you are calling connect. Okay, this function establishes a connection to the Mongo database. Okay, so what you are doing, you are importing mongoose, right? So you use this mongoose library to connect to a Mongo database, and then you do a connect. This Mongo has the URL to the cloud Mongo database. So this Mongo variable is the URL which has a connection to the cloud Mongo database. So using you can go to atlas.mongodb and then you can create a cluster and you can get this URL and you can use it here. So this is how I establish a connection to a Mongo database. Okay. So usually, right, um, connection to connection to a database or any operation in the database, right, should be done asynchronously. So it is better to add async keyword here, and then we have to wait until the connection is done, right? So you can add a await keyword here. Okay, so async keyword makes this function asynchronous so that it can be run parallelly. So the main thread will not be blocked. Okay, await makes will wait for this function to return. Okay, and then this will be printed. Okay, so if you run this code, right, first server running will get printed. Okay, because this is a async function, right? So this will be run parallelly, so the main thread will not be blocked. So server running will get printed, and after that, once the connection is established, this print will come. Okay, so this is what is the first thing. This is how you start a HTTP server and connect to a Mongo database. And then you have to write all your routes. Okay, for writing your routes, the main thing is that you have to use basically, right, you are telling Express. So in your backend, right, suppose this is a complete backend, right, you are writing your code. Okay, so this is your system, and in some system in the internet you have your MongoDB. Mongo database is there. So from your system, you establish a connection to a Mongo database using the URL. Okay, and then you have your Express framework. You have an Express framework. So you are telling the Express framework to start the HTTP server. How? Using app.listen. And then you are telling the Express framework. So all the HTTP request is going to come to your Express, right? And you are telling an Express framework that in the HTTP request there will be a URL, right? Okay, in our case it will be localhost, and it is running in port number 3000 colon 3000 slash to do. Okay, to do's. Okay, so for this route, okay, call this function. That is what you're telling here. You're telling Express for post route for this endpoint, call this function. So when when a HTTP post request comes to slash to do, express will call this function, right? And that's how your function gets called. Now post is what you have to put information in the database, right? So basically you already establish a connection to the Mongo database. Basically you collect the data from the HTTP request and then you put that information in the Mongo database, right? That is what you are doing in the post, right? So similarly, this is one of the routes, right? And similarly, you have to implement all the needed routes, right? And that is what is data backend design and implementation. Okay, so in this video, like basically we'll also complete how to basically put the information in the database. Okay, so first thing is you have to get the data from the HTTP request. So in this case, we are sending the request in request dot body. So these two information will come, title and description will come. I'm creating an object, the data received in the body. Okay, and then to store information in the database, right? You need to create a collection, right? Collection is nothing but a table, right? To create a collection, you need to create a schema. The schema is nothing but a JSON object which tells the structure of the data you're going to store. You're telling the title is of type string and the description is of type string. Okay, so with the schema, you're creating a collection. Using the schema, you create a collection called to do. If you give to do, two do's will be created, S will be added. Okay, so this is a collection. So to put an entry in the collection, right, you need to create an object for this. Okay, so what I'm doing, I got the data and I'm creating an object for this, right? I'm creating an instance for this, okay, to put an entry, right? And then I'm using this data. So an entry will be created to put in the collection and I'm just putting that entry dot save. Now the data will be saved in the database. And once the data is saved, what you have to do? I have to send a HTTP response. This is a success case, right? So I am setting status 200 and whatever data I am putting, right, I am converting that to JSON and sending it in the response. This is how you have to send the response. And a console log message. Okay, if so, this I am putting all this database communication in the try block because any issue happens in the try block, the cache block will be invoked. I'm logging the error and I'm checking error response in the clash block. So this is how you implement a route. Now I implemented a post route. So whatever routes you needed and whatever collection you needed, you need to create a schema for that collection. Create a using this model class. You need to create a object for this, a class for that. You need to create a collection, and then you need to create an instance for the collection to store data. This is the base of backend.